Welcome back to Fast Market here on the TD Ameritrade Network. I'm Tom White, joined by my co-host Joe Mazzola. But let's bring in our next guest for our cash tag segment. That's going to be Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at LikeFolio. Welcome back to the show, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday is right. So we're talking NVIDIA. We're seeing a rebound. I mentioned it's up 16% this year. It's up 19% now. It's up over 4% today. But this one, the Achilles heel for NVIDIA this year, or over the past year, has been, gaming numbers have come down. Bitcoin traded under 20K. That one's made some inroads to the upside. We're starting to see some stabilization in some of their other silos of revenue generation. What kind of data are you guys seeing out of LikeFolio? Is this rebound in the stock warranted?
Yeah, so whenever we look at NVIDIA, you make a really good point about some of these weak spots, some of this, tempering in gaming growth. Actually, on our end, when we look at macro level mentions of people who are talking about gaming, or specifically PC gaming, those are down by about 15% year over year. So this is a big headwind for NVIDIA. But when we look big picture at everything NVIDIA has to offer, across its suite of services, that demand is actually starting to pick up some momentum. So whenever we look at purchase intent mentions, and these could be people who are talking about, engaging with any of NVIDIA's products or services, from gaming to its data center business, those mentions in Q4 are pacing about 27% higher year over year. And that's this bar on the far right of this chart that's highlighted with that red square. And this quarter ends in just over a week. It ends on January 29th. So this pace is actually an improvement versus Q3. We had Q3 at about 19% growth year over year. So for us, this shows a little bit of a momentum gain. And a lot of this is driven by, its strength in its data center. But also we're seeing kind of some surprising strength in its GeForce, or its RTX 40 series. And this is, kind of leans in toward that gaming. So this seems a little bit counterintuitive, but they did just release a new GPUs in October, and we saw those be really well received by consumers. And we're watching really closely because they'll release the 40 series laptops in February. So this is something that we're tracking, but it definitely is interesting to see NVIDIA, start to gain some momentum back. I think another thing that they're doing well is, they were able to react to those kind of walls that were put in place in regard to selling their technology overseas, specifically to China. They were able to develop and kind of deliver some alternative products that meet the minimum threshold that was set by the U.S. government. And so I think that it's relevant that NVIDIA was nimble and able to respond to kind of those headwinds. And also it's just worth noting that, while gaming is certainly a weak spot, and we expect it to be a weak spot in 2023, NVIDIA has many other levers that it can pull. And one of these big levers that we're watching recently is AI. And one of the ways that, this is something that NVIDIA has been involved with for some time, but recently they announced a partnership with Microsoft to help enterprises essentially train, deploy, and scale AI. So I think that this is just one example of how NVIDIA is able to kind of, when one area of its business is weak, it can shift into a different segment, and a growing segment, certainly. So, we're seeing some nice momentum build at NVIDIA.
So, Megan, we've seen the momentum build in the price as well, too, right? Up $70 from the October lows. It's hard to kind of distinguish how much of that is kind of already built in, how much of that optimism is already built in. But yes, as you look into 2023 product cycles, you mentioned the February release. Does that give an additional leg to potential upside for the stock here?
I think that it's definitely something, especially if this does well, that could outperform kind of these negative expectations that are set, especially in regard to that gaming side of its business. If it can outperform here, that could be a positive sign. But for us, we definitely think and agree that a lot of this momentum could already be priced in. Whenever we look just from an earnings signal perspective, obviously earnings isn't for at least another month. Our earnings signal is pretty neutral right now. So we think that, it's probably priced about right. But whenever we take a step back and look long-term and larger scale, that AI chart that I showed, that's probably one of our top trends in 2023. And this is an area where NVIDIA is really leaning into. So I think from a long-term perspective, NVIDIA may be even better positioned for future growth.
Now, if you look at the different silos of revenue generation for this company, Megan, it's pretty widespread. You mentioned the innovator in this particular space. Chip names, as far as the hardware goes, still falling a little bit. But then you look at autonomous. You look at AI, as you mentioned, Microsoft with the Chat GPT. I don't understand a lot of it, but it seems like that's where everybody's going as far as the tech world goes. One of the analysts compared it to Apple coming out with the iPhone when cell phones were starting to become popular, that the opportunity that Microsoft and some of the chip makers like Nvidia have in this space. Is that what leads you and investors, after the stock's fallen so precipitously over the last year, that, hey, maybe there's some optimism? And I know they don't have earnings coming up. Do you have an earnings score on this?
Yeah, so I think that that's exactly right. And one of the ways that we like to gauge this long term is to kind of plot NVIDIA versus other major peers and competitors. When we look at NVIDIA versus, AMD versus Intel, we see really strong outperformance in terms of buzz growth and also demand growth. And I think you'll also notice that the size of the circle here, NVIDIA is the largest player versus peers as well. So it's nice, it's interesting to see, when it already is commanding this market share, that it's also leading in terms of year-over-year growth. So we like where NVIDIA is positioning itself. From a near-term, short-term perspective, though, our earnings signal right now is about a -6. So it definitely has room for improvement. We'll definitely be watching for improvement through the end of the quarter, and especially as it releases some of these new products. But, one thing that I think that we're really good at LikeFolio is identifying these long-term tailwinds and these big consumer trends. And I think that ChatGPT and this kind of introduction to AI for consumers is the first time that this feels really real and this feels really tangible. And it's kind of starting to click at, this is an area where NVIDIA can excel and can power and can help businesses actually harness and leverage this type of technology in their goals. So for us, whenever we look at this on a long-term signal, we're much more bullish for a name like NVIDIA, especially as it continues to outperform in the space.
Yeah, definitely able to offset some of the secular losses that they have in other portions of their business. All right, great stuff as always, Megan. Great data from you guys at LikeFolio. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys. You too.
All right, that's Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at LikeFolio, breaking down the data for us here on NVIDIA.